Hello and welcome to Autism in the Early Years. This is a webinar by Space Hertfordshire. My name is Kim Littlechild and I am the Services Manager and the Education Advisor for Space, and I will be delivering this online session for you today. So welcome. Before we start, I'd just like to share a bit about the charity and what we offer. So we are a charity that's been running for about 10 years now, and we support families and children and young people who are neurodiverse. Whether you're at the start of your journey or you're a seasoned traveller, then we are here to help you. We have a closed Facebook group that you could join if you're where you can post messages or ask questions to our community. We offer family support. We offer face-to-face support groups. That's for children and also for parents. We have a whole range of events and activities that you can access, including short break events and activities. On a Monday and a Wednesday and a Saturday morning, here at our offices, we open up lending space. That's kind of like a lending library. You can come along with your child. You can have a look at a whole range of resources. You can chat to some of our team, chat to other parents, access some of our sensory room, and generally it's a great opportunity for you to perhaps meet other families, and you can borrow equipment or resources to help support your child. We offer a lot of training and workshops for parents and schools. We also have an alternative provision offer for children who are out of school for whatever reason. And in the last year to 18 months, we have grown some of the professional services that we offer our families. So families can book occupational therapy appointments through us, education psychology appointments through us, speech and language. We have partnered with a clinical psychology team around ADHD consultations and assessments. We offer QB checks and we offer dyslexia screenings and dyslexia assessments at the moment. So if any of that sounds interesting to you and you'd like to know a bit more, then on screen you'll see some scannable QR codes, which gives you information of how to access our wider offer. Or you can visit our website at spacehearts.org.uk to find out more. So that's www.spacehearts.org.uk. So if you just want to pause the screen for a second, just so that you can scan some of the QR codes, then feel free. Okay, so in this module, we are going to explore some autism myths and facts, things that you may have read on the internet, or I don't know, your neighbour may have spoken to you about. So we're gonna debunk some myths and we're gonna confirm some of the facts around autism. We're going to look at the 4 key areas of difference, and we're going to look at how children make sense of the world around them when they have autism. So I'm going to bring up some statements on the screen and talk you through whether they're facts or myths. So the first one, fact or myth? Autism is a lifelong condition. Well, that's a fact. Autism is lifelong. You can't catch it. It's not contagious. You don't acquire autism. It is there for life. So yes, so autism is a lifelong condition. The next one, myth or fact? All autistic people are good at maths, art and music. That's a myth. Some autistic people may be very good at maths, art or music, but not all autistic people are good at maths, art and music. There have been plenty of stereotypes perpetuated over the years, but just because you're autistic, it doesn't mean that you have a Rain Man brain, that you're, it doesn't make you, especially good at maths, art or music. You might be, but it doesn't, because you're autistic, it doesn't mean that you 100% are going to be. So this one here, only children can be diagnosed as autistic. That's also a myth. There is no upper age limit that you can be diagnosed with autism. You can be diagnosed at any age, and as autism awareness grows, we are seeing more teenagers and more adults being diagnosed with the condition as they start to understand themselves better. So there is no upper age limit. You can be diagnosed at any age. Myth or fact, you can only be diagnosed after the age of 5. That is a myth. Some children can be diagnosed earlier than 5. So if someone is saying to you, your child can't be diagnosed before 5, then you can debunk that one. ADHD, yes, there is an age limit. There's a minimum age limit that a paediatrician would normally look at. But for autism, you can be diagnosed earlier than 5 years old. Autism is present both in boys and girls. That's a fact. Both boys and girls can be diagnosed. It's not just a boy thing, and actually what we're seeing is that there's increasing understanding about how autism generally can present differently in boys and girls. Generally, girls tend to cope better and camouflage it better at school and socially, so it's often not recognised until they're older. But both boys and girls can be diagnosed with autism. Autism is a developmental disorder involving the brain. Well, we're tending to move away from the word disorder and use the word difference, but yes, if you are autistic, your brain is wired differently from a non-autistic person's, and a non-autistic person's brain is wired differently from an autistic person's brain. It doesn't mean that one is better or worse or more able or less able than the other. It just means there is a difference in how information is processed. So yes, there is a difference in the way brains are wired. Autism may be accompanied by differing degrees of ability. Yes, autism can be present alongside many other neurodevelopmental conditions. So yes, it can be accompanied by different degrees of ability or neurodevelopmental conditions. We often see ADHD might be co-occurring with autism. So yes. And the next one. Autism is genetically linked. There is an increased rate of occurrence with other family members. Actually, that's a fact. Autism has been found to run in families, but we don't yet know the exact genetic cause, but there is definitely a link, and it's more likely if other family members have got the condition as well. So hopefully that was helpful. We're going to look at the next slide now. So here we go. So this slide looks at 4 key areas of difference, really. So these are the 4 main areas where if you have an autistic brain, it might be more challenging. So the first one here is interacting. You may find that spending, a child with autism, you may find that spending time with people is really quite stressful, or you may find that they prefer to spend time alone. They may not make as much eye contact, and they often might appear to not listen or respond to their name. Other ways that you might notice some differences in the way that they're interacting is they may show little or no interest in interacting with others. And they may find it quite difficult to understand games and turn-taking. So those are the key differences, really, in understanding how the social behaviour. And they might find it tricky to understand the feelings of others. Some of the other things that they may find, you may notice around their sensory processing, is that autistic people might be sensory avoiders or sensory seekers. So we'll cover a bit more of this later, But you might find that your child or your young person is seeking certain sensory stimulation, or might even be avoiding it. So when it comes to processing information, the difference that we see there really is that they may take language very, very literally. So, I don't know, the classic one is to say, oh, come on, pull your socks up. You know, come on, sort yourself out, pull your socks up. That could be taken quite literally and could be very confusing for someone. So if you have autism, you might take language really quite literally. And those little nuances that we use throughout the ways we communicate can be picked up, can cause confusion. You might find that they have really intense interests in certain toys or topics, like quite specific interests in things, and they'll know detail about everything. They'll be able to say words, you know, the names of dinosaurs that you can't even pronounce. So they may become, when they're interested in something, it can become quite intense for them. What you may also find is that your child might need some extra processing time, so just a little bit longer. So you might say something to them and you might think that they haven't heard you, but then you might see them doing that a bit later or repeating that a bit later, or they may just need a little bit longer to act on some of the information that they receive. And then another key difference really is around communication. So when it comes to differences in understanding and expressing ourselves through communication and language, this can also include understanding verbal and non-verbal language, such as gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice. And as mentioned before, lots of autistic people have a very literal understanding of language and can think that people mean exactly what they say. So it might be difficult for them to use or understand things like tone of voice, facial expressions, jokes and sarcasm can be quite tricky for them to understand. In the early years, what you might find is that there's a speech delay or that they're learning language differently. So some children may be pre-verbal or have limited speech, but understand more of what other people say to them than they can actually express. The turn-taking of social communication may not be quite as instinctive and can lead to one-sided interactions as well when it comes to communication. And they might find it difficult to tolerate other people in their space. So when it comes to like making sense of the world, some autistic children in the early years might focus on details instead of the bigger picture. So for example, if they're playing with a toy car, they may focus on the wheels of the car instead of seeing the whole toy car. So they might be more fascinated by the way something works or the mechanics of something than they are in using a toy, perhaps in the functional way or the typical way that we might see other children. Some children can also display repetitive or seemingly limited play skills, repeating actions with toys or objects, sometimes preferring to play by lining toys up instead of using more imaginative play, or playing the same games each day. This is still play. So I think historically we've got caught up in they're not playing imaginatively, or they're not doing this. But lining things up can be on an autistic child's way of playing. So it's just a difference. Some children may find any self-directed time difficult and may prefer like the child-initiated play. If they're at preschool or nursery, anything that's quite structured or they have to conform to, that can be quite challenging sometimes. And they may prefer sort of having the room to themselves. Other children might prefer the structure. and that whole free play is too overwhelming for them. So it can vary on child to child, but knowing your child is a really, really important thing, and understanding what their preferences are can be really, really useful. Okay, so we're going to look at sensory processing in a bit more detail now, because this is a really, really important part of understanding autism and looking at the world from the viewpoint of an autistic child. So when we talk about sensory processing, we're talking about something that happens in the brain. So our brain receives information from our eyes, our ears, our mouth, and we process this information so that we know what is going on around us. So for a long time, it has been thought that humans just have 5 senses. But we now know that we have far more than 5 senses. So in this webinar, we're going to be looking at 8 of these in further detail. So we're going to spend some time looking through each of the different senses. So the first one is touch. That's a pretty obvious one. That's around how we experience things through our hands, perhaps the type of clothing that we wear. And sight will also be one that's quite familiar to you. We process information by things that we can see, what we look at, things that we can't see. Sound is one that we're also probably all familiar with, how we process information. You can be in another room and hear your child cry and know that you need to, what kind of cry that means, and you need to get there pretty quickly. So sound is a way that we process information. Smell as well. So we might know, if you're smelling that carton of milk in the fridge, you might know whether that's off or whether it's safe to drink. So smell is a really, really important way that we process information, as is taste, whether something tastes right or not. But the ones that you might be less familiar with, we have what we call vestibular, so that's balance. So that's knowing that we're upright, knowing that we're sitting down, knowing that we're leaning backwards or leaning forwards. So that's quite an important one that we have. That's one of our senses. Then the other one is proprioception. That's our body awareness, knowing where we are in any given space. So knowing where my arm is, even if I can't see it. Knowing that my arm's behind me or my hand's in front of me. So that's what we call proprioception. And the other one that is really important is our internal processes, our interoception, which is that's knowing that we're hungry, knowing that you might need to go to the toilet, knowing that you're feeling a bit sick, knowing if you've got pain in your body. And for some children with autism, that's really difficult for them to process. So I don't know if any of you have had your child has been really off for a couple of days and you're like, I just don't know what's wrong with you. And it's not even about the fact that perhaps they haven't got the language to tell you, but they might not know that they're feeling ill or they're feeling sick. And it's probably not until, I don't know, perhaps 24 hours later when the sickness bug has come out that suddenly you realise, oh, you were coming down with that. Or they might not understand that they're hungry, or they might not recognise that they're full, and just keep on eating. Which kind of brings us on to the fact that some children may appear oversensitive when the brain processes too much information, or undersensitive when the brain just isn't processing enough information. So some children may be oversensitive to one sense and undersensitive to another. So you could be oversensitive to noise and like, oh, I can't bear it, moving away from any loud noise or any type of noise. But you might be really, really undersensitive to smell. And so, or taste. So that's when we find lots of children perhaps putting things in their mouth or smelling things. Okay, so typically, if a child is oversensitive to a sense, then they'll avoid that stimulus. So if they're oversensitive to any one of these, then they'll avoid it. So if they're oversensitive to noise, or if they're oversensitive to touch, they might avoid you touching them, or they might avoid the sounds. But if they're undersensitive, then they're going to seek that out. So some children are undersensitive to touch, so they might like a lot of pressure. They might like you to squeeze them really, really tight. In some cases, I know some children have asked for their parents to sort of like sit on them, but that can be, I recommend doing that safely. But if you're undersensitive, then you're going to seek out that stimulus. And what we also find is that many autistic children will just focus on one sense at a time as part of their processing. So they can either listen to you or look at you, but often they can't do both. So we typically find that with children with autism, they concentrate so hard on looking at you because as a society, we expect you to look at us if we're speaking to you, but they're focusing so much on that they won't have heard a word that you said. And vice versa. If they're listening to you, then they might find it really difficult to make eye contact. So if someone is having difficulties with sensory processing and sensory integration, we might see some of the following. So we might see a child who avoids moving, climbing, swinging, or sliding. Okay, we might see a child who doesn't like to be touched by others. We might see a child who's refusing to engage in messy play or avoiding to engage in messy play because they just can't bear that feeling on their hands. We might see a child who appears constantly anxious, because if you're in a world that is constantly trying to encourage you to do things that you are really averse to, then that can be really, really difficult. And as a child, you're also fairly powerless in some instances. We might see a child who is half asleep and needs to be prompted to engage in a task. They might need help with being motivated. We might see a child who puts their hands over their ears and complains of noise if they're struggling to process sensory stimulus around them. We also might see a child who struggles to regulate themselves and becomes easily overexcited and difficult to bring down. We might see a rigid, stiff, or a tense child, a child who is always touching objects. So if they're undersensitive to touch, they might always be touching objects, people, or always kind of like fiddling with things. We also might see a child who can't sit still and constantly fidgets all the time. That will be to do with their proprioception and where they are in space. So that child who's in the chair and constantly fidgeting on the chair or constantly moving up and down, that's quite common. We also might like to see a child who just likes to run and run and run, or loop around certain things. So there are, that might be something that we see. Okay. So sensory avoiding, this is when there's just too much information going into their brains. So when it comes to avoiding some of the things that we might see, where they're oversensitive, they might have aversions to different types of light. It might just be really, really bright to them. Lots of LED lights that we're seeing now, they're just too bright for some of our children. They might be unable to filter out background noises because they're just oversensitive to sound, or particular smells can be overpowering, like the smell of a candle, or even you just, cooking something at home. If they're oversensitive to taste, then often they'll have quite restricted bland diets. Often it's beige food and often it's processed food that they prefer. Touch might be uncomfortable or painful for them. So if you're oversensitive to touch, what we might think of as just, a nice woolly jumper can feel like sandpaper to people who are oversensitive. When it comes to that vestibular sense, they may have difficulties with activities where control of movement is needed. So in terms of balance or hand-eye coordination, and if you're talking about where that proprioceptive sense, they may have difficulties with fine motor activities. And then a bit like we touched on this before, but that those internal senses, that interoception, they may constantly have a feeling that they need to use the toilet but not be able to go, or they may not recognize that they need to go to the toilet at all. So it can be quite complicated, but once you get a bit of an understanding, you'll start to see patterns in your children and you'll start to understand them a bit better. So just to expand a bit more on this, if you're undersensitive to sight, you may have really poor depth perception. So you may not be able to gauge whether it's okay to step off that step. Where is the floor on that in that case? If you're undersensitive to sound, you may not even be able to acknowledge certain sounds. You may not even have tuned into it. So that can be tricky. When it comes to smell, we talked a bit about this, about sniffing and licking objects or people. If you're undersensitive to taste, and like if you're really undersensitive to taste, you may have something called pica, which is when you eat non-edibles such as grass or dirt. I've seen children be really focused on something like blue tack, like literally pull displays off walls so that they can get to the blue tack. Touch, you might have a high pain threshold. So we talked about deep pressure, or sometimes what you also see is children not realizing that they've hurt themselves. They might go down, bang, they've really fallen hard, but they just get up like nothing's wrong. And you're like, God, that must have really hurt, but they show no sense of recognizing pain. That vestibular one, that's about that needing to rock, spin, or swing quite a lot. And the proprioceptive I also mentioned before, that's kind of, you might lounge, really lean on people, might appear quite clumsy. And then interoception, that I just mentioned that before, a bit like being undersensitive, is about perhaps not really recognizing the need to use the toilet, or leaving it to the last minute, or knowing when you're hungry. So what do we do? It's like, it's all very well knowing that, right? But what can we actually do about it? Well, it can be really helpful to provide a real mixture of sensory stimulation throughout the day to help your child feel more regulated and a bit more balanced. So when we look at, we talk about this as being sensory integration. So how we integrate our senses so that we can feel in balance. Now, most of us can do that throughout the day through different things. I know that I can sit at my desk and I'm kind of like getting a bit fidgety. I can get up and go for a walk. But some of our children need a bit more planning and a bit more direction with that. So when we're talking about sensory integration, what we look at specifically are, we call these like sensory circuits. We look at alerting activities, and those alerting activities can help with overstimulation. So for example, we might play games where we're throwing a ball at a target or into a bucket, sequences of kind of like little jumps, big jumps, like do 5 little jumps, 1 big jump. So they're alerting our sensory systems. They're waking it all up, activating it. Then we would look at doing some organizing activities. So this is where you've become really alert, but now you're beginning to focus down and become a bit more attentive on something. So this might be doing log rolls, rolling over and over and over. So it's a bit more focused, requires a bit more attention. You might have your, I don't know, hands clasped and your arms stretched above your head. Might require you to, I don't know, stand inside a hula hoop that's on the ground and spin, but without going outside the hula hoop. Then stopping and standing still, and then pressing your hands on your head. That's quite a good activity. Putting your hands on your head can be really grounding. And then we might look at doing some calming activities. So this can be particularly useful for children who might overreact to things or can be really quite anxious. So placing feet or hands like in weighted bean bags, just to feel that feeling of grounding, lying under a weighted blanket, those kind of activities, or you know, having a cushion, or being hugged. Those kind of things can be really calming for children. And then we would look at doing these in a circuit. Yeah, so you might do an alerting activity, and then a little bit later do an organizing activity, and then a calming activity, and then a bit later you might do an alerting activity. So you kind of get into what we call this circuit, this cycle. Okay. So looking at how we can support children with communication. We know that communication requires two participants. One person who is giving the communication and the other person who is receiving the communication. It's a two-way thing. And communication is a really effective way of getting our wants and needs met. It's a social activity and it is about exchanging information. So it's more than just speech. So 80% of it is around non-verbal communication and 20% is spoken words. So a really good example of this is the word fine. Yeah? Somebody says to you, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, actually. Great. Another way is like, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. It's like your tone of voice, your non-verbal communication, two very, very different messages, but you have said the same word. So that's what we mean when communication is more than just speech. It's about all the other non-verbal cues and communication that comes with it. So yes, words are really, really important, but what we also communicate with is our body language, the tone of our voice, our behavior. All of those things play a really, really important part. So what are the necessary conditions for communication to develop? How can we best support our children and our young people to do this? Well, it's a developmental process, and communication skills grow, and like any other growing process, they need certain conditions for it to be successful. And those conditions are us as adults. Okay, how we adjust and how we create conditions to support the development of social communication is really, really important. And with children with autism, quite often they need different conditions than children who don't have autism. So the first thing we would look at is making sure that your child has a reason to communicate. So particularly for children who are pre-verbal or perhaps are not yet as independent as perhaps their siblings or whatever, when we're really, really busy parents, we have a tendency to perhaps do more for them than, because it's quicker, right? It's quicker. It's kind of like, oh, we need to be out of the house in 5 minutes and you've got to have your shoes and your socks on because you've taken them off, and I don't even know where the socks are actually. So it's quicker for us to get those socks, sit the child down, put the socks on, put the shoes on, and you're out the door, right? Or you might know that it's getting to about 11 o'clock. Your child is normally really hungry by this point. Actually, you've already got the snack out. But giving your child a reason to communicate is a really, really important thing that you can do. So, and communication doesn't have to be words. Okay, so if they want a snack, then even just looking at the fridge, pointing at the fridge, can be a really, really useful way. So you have to give them a reason. So some of the reasons that they might communicate might be to respond or request something. Some of your children might be good at this already. We also communicate to protest or refuse something. And we also communicate to get attention. So, or to give information, or to think and plan and share ideas. So these are all really, really important reasons why we use communication. So you need to have a reason to communicate. You need to have a desire to communicate. So that's why sometimes you'll find that speech therapists will give you a task to do with your child, which is where what they really want is inside a box. So they either have to tap the box or tap the picture or give you the box so that they're communicating with you so that they can get what they want. You always need someone to communicate with and something to communicate about. And we need to give our children the tools to communicate, how to communicate. If you're pre-verbal, it's going to be really difficult using words. So that's why we often use visuals, and we'll come on to that a bit later. Okay. So how do early communication skills develop? And how might that differ for our children with autism? Well, we may see that communication skills develop much more slowly. Okay, you may find that they show no interest in faces, and might be showing more interest in the environment rather than people. This can be a sensory thing. Okay, we might see actually their speech development differ. So typical speech development tends to be around mimicking and copying sounds. But what you might find is that a child with autism doesn't copy sounds and may not speak until they're 3 or later, but then comes out with whole sentences, like with chunks of words that they've already put together. Their speech might develop later. We tend not to use the phrase non-verbal anymore. We tend to use pre-verbal. Non-verbal tends to imply that a child is never going to speak, but we do know that because there can be speech delays for children with autism, some children don't speak until they're 7 or sometimes older. So we tend to use the term pre-verbal more than non-verbal now, but your child may be pre-verbal for longer. Spoken words might be quite functional in how they're used, and quite often we'll see echolalia. Echolalia is a really important part of speech development in autism. It can feel like it's not, but it is. But echolalia is when a child just repeats back what they've heard. So you might find that they're repeating whole chunks of something from a cartoon that they've seen. And you'll be a bit like, I don't understand why you keep doing that. But it's really, really important part of speech development for children with autism. We also find that there are differences with understanding communication. They can find it really, really difficult to understand more complex language. So the speed that we speak, the amount of words, the content we use, it can be really, really difficult to process too much information. So if you are communicating with your young child with autism, then keep your language short and sharp. Not sharp as in unpleasant, but kind of like quite condensed, and just keep key words in what you want to say. There may be some differences in understanding non-verbal communication. It could be really, really tricky for them to pick up on non-verbal cues, even just the facial expressions. They can find it difficult to understand why other people do what they do, and there can be quite a literal understanding there as well. Sometimes we see that there's difficulties with flexible thinking, what we call flexible thinking. What we mean by that is understanding why people think differently to them, and understanding that there could be a different way of thinking about something. And we particularly see this in like different environments and with different people. We also see our difficulties with what we call expressive communication. So some children don't know why. Why do we need to do social communication? They may not understand how to communicate non-verbally. There's turn taking. We might see that there's intense interest in something. But all these differences can cause huge anxiety in some of our children. They can feel really misunderstood. We can feel frustrated because we don't understand. But particularly in young children in early years, that frustration can result in behaviours that we find quite difficult or quite distressed behaviour in our children and young people. And that can be tricky to manage. That can be really tricky to manage. So due to some of these differences, we have to think about ways that we adjust our own interactions just to help increase their understanding. So we've talked a lot about the barriers that some autistic people and children experience when it comes to communication. We're going to think about ways that we can support children with their communication and increase their understanding and reduce that frustration that they might experience. So one of the ways that we can do is we can use the child's name first to get their attention. So if you say Jack and then pause, say Jack, shoes, then not only have you said their name first, but you've also reduced your language, okay? Or Jack, put shoes on, or Jack, get shoes. It's a really useful way to start. You've reduced the language, you've reduced the amount of information that they need to process. You've said their name so that they know that you're talking to them. If you just said get your shoes, you could be talking to anybody, okay? But if you say their name first, then that can be really, really helpful. Okay. And giving that time to process. So that's what I mean about saying giving that pause. But also after you've said, Jack, get your shoes, it's kind of just watching and waiting. Might not be able to do it immediately, might take him a bit of a while to process, and then you might see him do it. So give him time to process. If you genuinely think he hasn't heard you, then you probably need to repeat the instruction. So this is a really, really important one. So using the phrase then to help children understand a sequence of events. So we know that transitions can sometimes be really tricky, but what you can say is, first we're doing this, then we will. So if they really, really want, I don't know, those McDonald's chicken nuggets, it might be, first, we need to get into the car, then we'll get the nuggets. Okay, so really sequencing those events. It might be, first we'll have a bath, then we'll read a story. First, we'll put our shoes on, then you can have your drink. So really, really helping children understand that sequence of things, because particularly when they're younger, not always, some older children, but particularly when they're younger, that everything has to be immediate. And if I don't get it now, I might never get it. So the phrase then, using first and then, can be really, really useful. Giving choices. So even in early years, we can give what we call quite restricted choices. So it might be you can have the yogurt or the apple. You can have you can play with the trains, or you can play with the Lego. You can wear the red jumper or the blue jumper. So giving available choices can be really, really helpful way of minimizing conflict. You might need to give 3. Some children respond better to 3 than they do to 2. But giving choices is a really useful strategy. And understanding that something has finished can be really, really tricky sometimes. So if you use the word finished, and you might want to use the Makaton symbol for that. So the Makaton symbol is finished. So use finished to help children understand that an event or something has completed. Okay. And say things in the order they will happen. I know I'm really guilty of this. It's kind of like, oh yeah, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna do that, and we're gonna do this and that, and after we've done that, we're gonna do this. So say things in the order that they will happen. So for example, if it is going to be dinner, bath, pajamas, then bed, make sure you give it in that sequence. So rather than going, right, it's going to be dinner, we've got dinner, then bedtime, but you're going to have a bath first. That can be too much information to process. So say it in the order that something is going to happen. This is a really, really useful one, and was really useful to me as a teacher. But tell a child what you're going to do tell a child what to do rather than what not to do. So we don't process negatives particularly well. So the classic is, if I said to you, don't think of a pink elephant, you are going to think of a pink elephant. Okay, so if you say to a child, don't run, they hear the word run. All right, so tell a child what to do rather than what not to do. So it might be, poor Jack, I keep talking about Jack, but it might be, Jack, you need to walk. Jack, walk. Rather than Jack, don't run. So those are just really good examples of what to do. So tell a child what to do. So it would be, I don't know, Jack, put the Lego away, or Jack, put the Lego in the box. That would be even better by making your instruction really specific. Jack, put the Lego back in the box. Or instead of saying, Jack, don't throw the Lego, Jack, put the Lego in the box. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. And using everyday visuals to help the child understand. So everyday visuals might be, I don't know, say it's dinner time, you might, or it might be time for them to have their milk before bed. You would use their cup as a visual to say, right, it's time for you to have a drink. Or if it's bath time, you might get their favorite bath towel out and go, right, it's time for a bath. Okay, so using everyday visuals to help the child understand what is happening next. So if you're going to the park or you're going outside, you might have their coat in your hand, or show them a picture of the coat. Okay, so that can be really, really useful to support what you're trying to say. And be in the same room, don't yell it from the kitchen. So if you're trying to communicate, please be in the same room. And what you might need to do with your young person or your child is actually be next to them or be in front of them. But at the very least, be in the same room. Don't yell up the stairs, don't yell down the stairs, don't yell from the kitchen, or even call out from the kitchen. Make sure you're in the same room with your young person. So other things to consider are about use less verbal and non-verbal communication. So if your child is getting really, really anxious, use less language, because less is more. Because, I mean, we could probably all relate to this. Like, if you're really overwhelmed by something, somebody keep chatting to you is really, really hard for you to process. So it's the same, and even worse if you have autism, because processing can be pretty tricky anyway. So use less language rather than more. So this is another way you can adjust your communication if your child is distressed. Just being really aware of the environment that you're in. So if you're in a busy shopping centre and you want your child to process instructions or information that you're giving them, it may be really, really difficult for them to process that because you're in such a noisy, crowded place. So just, if they're getting frustrated and you keep talking to them, just be aware of the environment that you're in and whether there's something in there. Is one of the lights buzzing overhead? Is there something that is interrupting their ability to process information. As much as you can, avoid using irony or sarcasm. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Really, really important. I know it can be difficult. Lots of us communicate through sarcasm, or that's how our families operate, but that can be really, really tricky. So say what you mean and mean what you say. So if you're trying to avoid something, like say the child really wants to go to the park and you go, oh yeah, we'll probably go later. What you really mean is no. We're not going to the park today. But it's much easier to say, oh, we might go later, because it avoids confrontation in that moment. Your child will remember that you said later, and that could cause a whole host of other difficulties further down the line. So if what you really mean is no, then you need to say no. It can be really, really helpful if you use timers or give advance warning before an activity is going to come to an end. So it might be that they need to tidy away, I don't know, the Lego or whatever they've been playing with, because you need to go out in 10 minutes. Give them a 5-minute warning so that you have got time to still get ready to go out. So just by saying, right, we're going out in 5 minutes, you need to finish what you're doing. We've got 2 minutes left. Got 1 minute left and then it's finished. So you give a regular countdown for that. I did mention this slightly earlier on, but never force eye contact. Eye contact can be really, really difficult. What you tend to find is that you speak to adults with autism and they've learned to focus on the person's ear or just past them. Okay, so it looks like they're looking at you, but they're not really. But don't force eye contact. It's quite painful. It often means that other senses can't process information. So avoid that if you can. And really consider what visual support you're providing your child. So there's tons of stuff on the internet, and I'm going to show you a few examples in a minute, but there's loads of different ways that you can provide visual support for your child. It can be really difficult, not only just processing information, but then remembering it. And particularly if you've got children in those, quite young children in those early stages, then using visual supports. We call them objects of reference. So that's when you might be using your cup to show that it's, or a plate to show that it's snack time, or, that kind of stuff. And then you can move on to visual timetables or first and then boards. But really, really look at the visual support that's available in your environment, because that can be really, that can be make or break for some families. So here's some of the visual supports that we would use every day. So we use stuff like, we get our visual supports from road signs, giving us directions, where to park when we go to the supermarket, medicine packets, food labels, all of those things. The list goes on. Okay, just take a moment to think about what visual supports you've used today. I've checked my calendar, I've checked my diary. I've worked with a young man this morning and we've used visual supports to structure our day. So we use visual supports to organise our life, often to make a choice, to communicate with others. How many of you send emojis in your texts or GIFs or that kind of stuff? So we are really visual. As human beings, we're really visual. But for some autistic people, this can be the vital tool. So visual supports help us to function. They help us to understand the world around us. Your child probably knew what McDonald's was before they could even know what a letter M was, right? I might be exaggerating. Some of your children might not know what McDonald's is. But there are key things that children will recognize and know and pick out visually. So visual supports can help us to function and to understand the world around us. And they provide us with really valuable information. So all autistic people can potentially benefit from using visual supports regardless of their age or ability. I've often seen in schools, in nurseries, in preschools, where they'll be using visual supports and the child will be functioning really, really well in the environment. And then the setting thinks that they're fixed and now they can take it away. And then the whole thing crumbles. When really the reason why it's working so well is because of those visual supports. It's not that the child doesn't need them anymore, but the child works really well because they've been provided. So we can all benefit from visual supports. And many autistic people are thought to be quite visual learners. So visual supports can encourage and support communication and language development. They can be shared. So not only might it, a visual timetable might start off by helping a child know what's happening throughout the day. It can move on to doing things like picture exchange. So if your child's language is developing at a later rate than others, it might be easier for them to pick up the picture of a yogurt and give it to you so that you know that they want a yogurt. So visual supports are a really, really important way of encouraging and supporting communication. They're also a really useful way of processing information. Trying to remember too much stuff. I can't remember loads of stuff. I need to write myself a list. So having things can help us process information, of knowing what to do first and then and next, all really, really important. And it can help increase understanding. So a word is just a sound that disappears, but having something visual in front of you is really, really concrete and can be really useful. It can provide structure for things, and it can really help promote independence and stop children being feeling frustrated. Okay. It can, like I said, it can reduce frustration and anxiety. Visuals are permanent; they don't change. Presenting information in a visual way really, really can be life-changing for some children. It can really support their self-esteem. If you look at some of the visual supports here, and the different ways that you can reinforce communication to our children. So here we've got now and next. That's our first one. That's a really common one. There's tons of information on the internet about now and next, but now we're doing this and next. Do a motivating activity. It's no point making the next thing more miserable than the first thing, because you'll find that your child never moves on. So now we're doing what I want us to do, and next will be something that you want to do. Okay, there's a visual timetable there. On there, there's a schedule. So how to make and use certain objects. There's different schedules on there. There's a choice board, so children can pick and choose from that one. And then we can use visuals as part of a bedtime routine. So that might not change. It will be we're having a bath, we put on our pajamas, we brush our teeth, we get into bed. So you can have like visuals as a bedtime routine about what to do. Other visual supports really support what we call the child's voice. So this is where they communicate. You can get lots of apps that children can learn to do this on as well. So this is about them expressing their wants and needs. And choice boards and communication boards really are about the child communicating. For some children, if you take away the visual, you take away their voice. So this is really important for pre-verbal children, as this may be the only way that they can communicate their needs. So what you might find is, particularly with younger children, if you're using objects of reference, if you're consistently using the same, plastic plate for snack, and you show it every time you give your child a snack, what you might find is that one day that your child goes and gets that plate and gives it to you, because they're communicating to you that they want that snack. Okay, so they're really, really important tools to use. And it's a way of maximizing children's ability to communicate, because you want them to communicate with you. So that's the end of it, really. It was a whistle-stop tour. But in conclusion, what we've done is we've explored an understanding of autism. We've explored how autistic children in the early years may view the world. We've looked at communication differences and sensory differences, different strategies that you might want to use to support. Your feedback is really, really valuable. So please scan the QR code or visit the link on screen to complete a short survey. But like I said at the beginning, Space is a charity that is here to support you. If you have any questions about what we've talked about in this webinar, or you want to find out more, or there was something you didn't quite understand, then please get in touch with us. We are really, really happy to help. And we're here for you. So thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you soon.